I was trying to decide what I should drink during the filming of this video, like either apple juice or this can that's probably not family friendly. There. Now nobody knows. Anyway, the point is I decided to have both because this is America and I'm a free spirit. So recently I started looking back through Bethesda Game Studios, Bethesda Softworks, the parent company, and ZeniMax Media, which is the parent company of all of that. I started going through their history, their corporate histories, and trying to figure out what could possibly explain some of the weird behavior we've seen from Bethesda Softworks and their subsidiaries in the last 3 to 4 years. In case you are somehow not aware, Bethesda has started to become very aggressive with their monetization practices. Things such as the Creation Club in all of Bethesda Game Studios games, such as Fallout 76 and even Skyrim on consoles, are very, very aggressive in how they price all of these things. And we've also seen Bethesda Game Studios come out with a lot of mobile games, getting into that market with Blades and Fallout Shelter. And I mean, there's a lot of different examples of how they've gotten greedy and aggressive. But for me, it's kind of interesting because ZeniMax, which owns all of these companies, is a privately owned firm. It's not like an EA or an Activision Blizzard or Take-Two Interactive, which are all publicly traded on stock exchanges. They're not publicly owned, so they don't have the usual demands from shareholders for returns on investment on a per share basis. They don't have that. They just are owned by a select group of people that have very high stakes in the company and own huge chunks of it. And usually when you have a privately owned company, the only time you'll see significant changes in how they do business is when either somebody new comes into the mix and starts to shake things up. So potentially, a new investor or a replacement investor or proxy, or maybe somebody changes how they're doing things. Or you see it when a new investor comes in, either to buy or having just bought a huge stake in the company, looking to do things their way, maximize the return on their investment. And so I started digging into the history going all the way back to the 70s with regards to the history of the founders of ZeniMax Media and all of the big movers and swingers with regard to this company. And I've tried to boil it down, reduce it to just the important parts. There's a lot of weird stuff in this story of ZeniMax Media and everything that goes on behind the scenes. So if you want to know more, I'll include a couple links in the description, but there's a couple interesting things I want to talk about that I think could explain why Bethesda has gotten so greedy recently.
It's pretty self-explanatory.
To begin, let's rewind the clocks all the way back to 1999, when ZeniMax Media, the parent company of Bethesda Softworks and Bethesda Game Studios, id Software, all of those guys, when they were founded. They were founded in May of 1999 by two people named Robert Altman and Kristoffer Weaver. Kristoffer Weaver being the guy that founded Bethesda Softworks and was in control of all of that. And he approached Robert Altman, who had a history in the banking industry, to be the CEO of this new parent company. And Weaver would serve as the CTO, or Chief Technical Officer, of ZeniMax, overseeing all of the studios, doing everything that actually created products. And this was actually a really good system. It seemed to work really well. Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple, is famously quoted as saying, "Every good business needs the nerd and the geek, and then the hippie. And you have to balance that kind of rational with artistic thinking, the reason with the emotion. You have to have those things working together. So you have to have the business expert and then the person who's more passionate about the minutia, all the little details." So it seemed to be a match made in heaven, and ZeniMax seemed to be doing very, very well for about 2.5 years. In 2002, Kristoffer Weaver, the guy that was in charge of all of the studios, in charge of Bethesda Softworks, his contract was not renewed, and he was effectively pushed out of the corporate structure at ZeniMax Media. He still owned the overwhelming controlling share in the company, but he was out. and he no longer had a position, and he no longer really had a say in the day-to-day workings of ZeniMax. And all sorts of crap went down with this. It looks as though Robert Altman, the CEO, went to the board of directors and stacked it in a certain way and convinced them that this guy, Christopher Weaver, yeah, he was passionate. Yeah, none of these studios would be ZeniMax's without him, but he wasn't good for the company, and so he needed to go, and they were able to boot him out. And as a result, Weaver sued ZeniMax Media, and it was this big messy thing. Eventually it was settled out of court, but that's kind of the stage that's set with this whole thing. Robert Altman and the people that are involved with the board of directors are fairly cutthroat, and they don't mess around, even with the people who they should emotionally owe a lot of credit to, the people that are responsible for founding the studios that make your company possible. It's stacked with people such as, of course, Robert Altman, and even, this is a fun thing I found in my research, Robert Trump, who's Donald Trump's younger brother, which is kind of cool. So yeah, the Trump family even owns a significant stake and has a lot of control over ZeniMax Media, and as a result, Bethesda Softworks and Bethesda Game Studios, which I just find it funny. I find it cool. And that's where everything was set up, and things went that way for a little over a decade, where they just released a few big games every couple of years, and they did pretty well for themselves, eventually accruing a net worth of around $2.5 to $3 billion. Most of their success came from Bethesda Game Studios, and even to this day, Bethesda Game Studios are considered to be their cash cow. Even if they have a game that's relatively unsuccessful, they can still rely on selling around 20 million copies, give or take 5 million, over the course of the first couple years that the game launches. Now, that is by no means an EA type of success. EA does that with 5 or 6 franchises every single year, so they're not quite on that level in terms of sales. But for a company that's only valued around $2.5 to $3 billion, that's pretty significant. And so they put a lot of weight and a lot of focus on BGS as their primary studio. And so if we fast forward the clock all the way to 2016, we can see some weird stuff start to happen behind the scenes over at ZeniMax Media. Now, like I said earlier, ZeniMax Media is a privately owned company. They are not publicly traded, so they don't have to disclose much of anything to the public. They only are disclosing it to the other co-owners and shareholders. So it's really hard to get information about this. But in May of 2016, an article was published to Bloomberg by Keel Porter, which basically discussed leaked news that a company by the name of Providence Equity Partners was looking to buy out a significant stake, or even outright the entirety of ZeniMax Media. Rewind real quick. Providence Equity Partners, it's a company that is a private equity firm. Basically, they're like Berkshire Hathaway, where they go around and they buy out companies or buy stakes in companies and then ask for returns on that initial investment. And they make their money by creating very, very strategic portfolios of companies that they own and manage. And something in ZeniMax Media really spoke to them. In 2007, Providence invested around $300 million into their coffers to help fund all sorts of expansions and acquisitions. And apparently a lot of that money even went towards the development of Skyrim, which of course would end up being one of ZeniMax's largest releases ever. And then in 2016, Providence was looking at ZeniMax and thought that there was a lot more money to be made, and they really liked what they were doing. They had just come off of Fallout 4, and they were getting ready to launch a bunch of other games by their other studios, from id Tech to Machine Games to Arcane Studios. They had a lot of stuff coming down the pipeline, and they thought that this could be a good time to buy in or buy out. And it's also important to know that Providence Equity Partners, they have a history of not just buying a larger stake in a company, they tend to just buy out. If they're going to get into a company, they tend to offer an initial little chunk of change, the $300 million, and then if that goes well, they'll look to buy out completely. So these discussions for a potential reinvestment or buyout were not insignificant. I mean, it was published to Bloomberg nationally as a result of these leaks by people that were familiar with the discussions. And I don't know about you, but when I realized that in May of 2016, it was unveiled that there was a private equity company looking to buy ZeniMax Media out, or at the very least give them a huge investment for expansion and growth. It explains a lot. It explains a whole lot, because if you are ZeniMax and you have this investor looking at you, you need to be as appealing as possible in order to get that investment. So you're going to start pushing all sorts of monetization models. You're going to start pushing all sorts of new practices and cutting all of the weight and expanding, showing that you're a really healthy company in order to be as appealing as possible. And it just seems to explain so much. Everything from the Creation Club to Fallout 76 as an online multiplayer game to even Bethesda Game Studios expansion into the mobile game market with something like Fallout Shelter getting doubled down on, and with Blades coming out. It seems like they're trying to make themselves incredibly appealing. They weren't just going along doing the same old Bethesda type of thing or ZeniMax type of thing. They were actively pursuing a big company, big corporate portfolio of products in order to be as appealing as possible to potential investors, which to me says one of two things. It either means that they were looking to be as appealing as possible to Providence Equity Partners or another similar firm and get either a buyout or a significant new investment of cash for further expansion. Or it means that they are getting ready for an initial public offering. But like I said, it's a private company, and in all of my digging, I can't find any reliable sources as to whether or not a full buyout is about to happen, or if they are revving up after all for an initial public offering. It could make sense if somebody such as Providence is looking at ZeniMax and saying, you know what, we could probably trade this on the open market. This is big enough for us to do an IPO and get ZeniMax in the ranks of Take-Two and EA. We're probably big enough to the point where we could do that. What they might do is they might buy out ZeniMax, and then they would take it and get it publicly offered through all sorts of initial offering services and companies. Or maybe ZeniMax is looking at that saying, wow, they think we could handle a IPO. That's awesome. So we're not going to sell. We're going to keep all of the profits to ourselves, and we're going to handle the IPO. Either way, they're getting ready for some sort of major move. And this alone can explain how Bethesda has gotten so unbelievably greedy, seemingly, in the last 3.5 years. Because 3.5 years ago is when they started having these discussions for a potential buyout. And what very well could be happening is that Bethesda and ZeniMax and id and all of these guys are just trying to make their company as appealing as possible, and then they're going to wait for the opportune moment, maybe, I don't know, around a Starfield or even an Elder Scrolls, and on the hype of all of that, set up an initial public offering and try to ride that wave all the way to the bank. It could explain a lot of the reason we've seen these seeming shifts in how they handle monetization, how they handle the releases of their games, and even the overall structure of their games. But like I said, there's a lot more that goes into this. There's all sorts of drama that went on behind the scenes with Robert Altman back in the 80s and 90s, being accused and indicted of all sorts of bank fraud stuff, eventually acquitted, and it was all tossed out of court. But there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes of companies such as ZeniMax. There's a reason they bury themselves behind all sorts of corporate legalism with regards to parent company of a parent company of a parent company of a parent company. They do that for a reason. It's because they want to be separated. They want to be able to handle their business apart from all of the other drama of the gaming industry, so that ZeniMax is considered just to be the business side of it, and then all of those other smaller companies that are owned by them are considered to be the artsy-fartsy types that nobody likes to negotiate with. And of course, all of this is way more complicated than I'm able to explain it in a 15-20 minute YouTube video, however long this ends up being. There's all sorts of interweaving demands and desires from different investors. For instance, there's a German company which owns a significant stake in ZeniMax called ProSiebenSat.1 Media Entertainment. It's like a major German conglomerate apparently, and they own a huge stake in ZeniMax, so they could have all sorts of motivations with regards to this. Again, we just don't know because it's privately owned. But from what I'm seeing here, it looks like they might not be privately owned for much longer.